Hi, this is Father Bill W. here in Austin, Texas, and welcome back to another episode of Inner Gold. We are going through the book by that title. The author is Robert A. Johnson, and it's a study in projection, how we give away some of the deepest and richest parts of ourself because they're too hot to handle. And if you've stayed with it through the first several episodes, I hope you're in for a treat on this one. I'm not going to do much of an introduction because we're right at the tail end, so you can't kind of make up for that. This chapter, it's his fourth chapter, is titled "The Once and Future King." And it is really a study in archetypal images. And I want to do a whole series on some of these concepts of Jung that might be helpful to us, the shadow, the archetype, the persona, the self, kind of help us differentiate some of those terms. But this one's going to deal with the archetype. And it's the archetype, the image, actually it's the God image that exists within the Western mind. So kind of keep that in your thoughts as we get going. So again, I'm going to hit on the sub chapter titles just as a way of introducing what the next little piece is about. And so the first of his is emergence of an archetype. He says, when we understand the archetypes that dominate a person or a culture, we can have profound insights into what is going on in that person or culture, and even make intelligent guesses about what might unfold. In a world that is increasingly difficult to understand, it can be helpful to go back to archetypal underpinnings to see if we can gain enough of an overview to make sense of the chaos. For me, Johnson says, this exploration began when I happened onto some little-known articles that Jung wrote between 1921 in 1945 about an archetype that was bubbling up in the psyche of the German people. Every German patient he saw, young and old, intelligent and unintelligent, seemed to be carrying a new archetype. He called it the blonde beast because it often appeared that way in the German unconscious. By 1930, it had surfaced enough so that he was able to identify it as a reemergence of Wotan, the berserk god of wisdom and war in Germanic and Norse mythology. Wotan is, in many ways, parallel to Dionysius in Greek mythologies. He's the ecstatic, attractive one with boundless energy who overturns so much. By the early 1930s, the movement of which Wotan was the archetypal force had a name, Nazism, and it was overtaking Germany. By 1940, it was rampant, and by 1945, it had left most of Europe in wreckage. This is a brief history of the emergence of an archetype in a culture within living memory. It isn't a good example, though, because it miscarried, but it could have gone in another direction. There had been legends throughout Europe that a Third Reich would rise up in Germany and be the salvation of Europe. Jung connected the old legends with his new stirring, and for more than 10 years, he watched carefully to see if a new dispensation, a new kind of life, the salvation of Europe might be emerging, but it turned out to be a stillbirth. History often sputters before it gets on the right side of a new capacity or a new evolution in human consciousness. We mustn't lose hope. There's something stirring out there in the world today. You kind of see it in more of a movement towards fascism. It's like democracy has a threat to it. People want to get things done, and so something starts stirring out there. I mean, I think you can really see it in Putin as he marches into Ukraine. It's scary. It's scary. And, you know, amazingly, some of the members of the church have turned to him and said, oh, this is a good thing. These archetypal powers are really strong. They're really dangerous. They can lead to good, or they can lead to terrible, terrible destruction. The next chapter is titled Salvation. Johnson says there are legends and predictions throughout the world of the once and future king, someone who has brought about a golden age and promises to come back in the future to restore it. Arthur, the great and noble king who brought England together in the sense we know it now, is one. It is said that Arthur didn't die at the end of his reign, but was transported to the Isle of Avalon, a place of healing, and that he offered when needed to come back. The magician Merlin, the introverted, inward-turned aspect of the Arthurian story, also said as he was leaving, I will come back to you again. In Mexico, just before his death, the god king Quetzalcoatl promised to come back if he was needed. According to Indian mythology, an avatar is sent to the earth every 1,000 years and at other times when there are specific difficulties. Buddha was one. In India today, there are rumors that a new avatar has been born who, when he comes to maturity, will set forth to be the new savior. If we take this literally, we might be disappointed. They come and they go. But in an interior sense, it's a real possibility, a point of intersection between our time-bound world and eternity exists for us, and that is salvation. I'm fascinated by this promise of a return, the once and future king. It's a glorious promise that can give us hope. So that's what he's going to develop in this chapter here. The depth of the archetype, the hope of the second coming that he's going to talk about, and it's an archetype. It's a myth that exists in many religions, in many cultures. That it's almost innate to what it means to be a human being, to be able to tap into this archetype, this image that is in the unconscious, and yet it's having its effect upon us. Stay with it. I think it'll get a little clearer as it goes along. Literalism is idolatry, is the next section. Literalism, taking this image literally, is idolatry. The British philosopher Owen Barfield said something that reverberates in my mind every day. He said, literalism is idolatry. If you take the inner world literally into our time-space world, you lose it. Throughout my childhood and adolescence, I was in love with the church and devoted to it. But as I grew older, I became critical and wouldn't have anything to do with it. Later, I read a medieval text that made Christianity real for me again. It said that Christ is constantly being conceived, constantly being born in his stable, constantly confounding the elders, constantly betrayed by Judas, constantly crucified, constantly resurrecting, and most wonderful of all, constantly in his second coming. The doctrine of the second coming of Christ is, for Christians, the greatest telling of the story of the once and future King. Early Christians said that on the 8th day after his resurrection, Christ will come and usher the world into the millennium, when time will end, strife and suffering will stop, and the kingdom of heaven will be at hand. Taken literally, this story doesn't make very much sense. It's too abstract, too far out of reach. If we wait for this literally, we'll wait till doomsday. But when we take this story out of literalism and into the interior world, which has no time and no space, we have an immediate living fact. If we take the full story of Christianity inwardly as a timeless fact, these possibilities are available for us to touch as soon as we are ready, or perhaps even as soon as we choose. The second coming of Christ is not just available to us, it is beating on our doors. I think an understanding like this about the inner world, about the great reality who is within you, within me, is available if we know how to approach that reality. If we're looking for it with a microscope, we'll never see it. If we're looking for God with a telescope, we'll never see it. All right? But if we'll look with the eyes of imagination, the eyes of intuition, the eyes of the unconscious, we can experience it. All right? But if you try to do it literally, it's going to explode. It's not going to happen. That's what he's getting at. Sabbath. It was expected that Christ would return within the octave, 8 days, and put an end to the cyclic nature of life. The 8th day is Sunday, and so Christians celebrate Sunday as their holy day. When we celebrate on Sunday, we celebrate the ushering into the kingdom, and we relocate ourselves outside of time and in eternity. Since it's the 8th day of the week, the expectation was that there was only going to be one of them. If we want to be logical, we could say that it didn't work because Monday turns up. But symbolically, in the depths of our unconscious, there is only one day of the second coming of Christ. There is only one Mass and one day of worship. It is not a process. Christianity puts an end to process and to the cyclic nature of man's sojourn on earth. According to Jewish custom, the Sabbath is on the 7th day. There are 7 days followed by the first day again. This is the myth of eternal return. Mircea Eliade points out that more people on earth believe in the cyclical nature of time than in the linear nature of time. Sabbath, Saturn, and Saturday are all associated with the number 7. Seventh-day Adventists celebrate the Sabbath on Saturday, 7 is the symbol of cycle. If you deal with numbers in your dreams or in mythology, you'll get lost if you take them literally. Numbers have their own symbolism, and at this level of comprehension, they are about quality, not quantity. A delightful Chinese story illustrates this. The Chinese army was in a desperate, beleaguered situation, and so the general met with his advisors to decide what to do. Should they retreat and save what they could, or make a desperate effort to try to break out? They stayed up all night discussing the pros and the cons, and at dawn, they took a vote. 6 said retreat, and 4 wanted to fight it out. So they fought, because 4 is so much better a number than 6. There is a non-literal way of thinking. Of course, they won. The story wouldn't have survived if they hadn't. Jung makes a great deal out of 4s, that it's the number of wholeness. It completes the circle. It signifies the square. It contains things. 6 is all over the place, but 4, you can wrap your mind around it. Why? Because there's an archetypal element to 4, and it goes back to an experience of wholeness, of the circle that out of which we came, the circle of life that we emerged from. Edward Edinger, in his book Ego and Archetype, has a marvelous chapter in the beginning where he talks about how consciousness emerged out of the circle of wholeness. And Piaget, I think it is, who did a lot of studies with young kids, studied their doodles where they were drawing figures of people. And fascinating that when a kid, a 2, 3, 4-year-old, is asked to draw a person, the person is generally round. It's complete. It's a circle. It's what the kid has experienced inside. And then as they get a little older, 5, 6, 7, you start to see stick figures arise. So if they're asked to draw a person, now it has a head and a trunk and legs and arms. The stick figure has arrived, but at the expense of wholeness. You following this? And so what Jung is trying to get at, and I think what we're trying to get at, is a sense of completion, a sense of wholeness, a sense of serenity, a sense of unity, a sense of joining. All right? Well, you're going to find this inside. I don't know that you're ever going to find it on the outside. If I'm looking for the great reality out there, I'm going to miss it. But if I can learn to take my spirituality seriously and look for God inside, in the very last place you'd ever think to look for God, in your own life, you're going to find him. You're going to find him. All right? Last place you'd ever look. Next title, The Heavenly Jerusalem. Envision the second coming of Christ as an inner reality that takes place on the 8th day of the week. 8 is a symbol of infinity, as you can see when you turn the numeral 8 onto its side. A baptismal fount has 8 sides to indicate that when a child is baptized, he's initiated into the 8-sided consciousness, eternity. On this symbolic level, there is nothing past the number 8. You've annihilated the cyclic nature and completed life. A Brahmin friend in India told me, Robert, you know the word Maya, the Indian concept that the world is illusory, a construct. Let me tell you about Mahamaya. Maha means great. Mahamaya is the ultimate reality. It means looking at Maya with intelligence, looking at illusion in a fresh way is the heavenly Jerusalem. This is not a promise, but a fact right now. If you can jump out of time, which we are capable of doing, we can see any given moment as eternity. We don't have to travel anywhere or even to wait in line. This is not a new fact. It's a fresh way of looking. Chuck C. did a marvelous book for a retreat that he did many, many years ago. He's one of the, not pioneers, but certainly was an old timer in AA and carried a powerful message. Wrote a book called A New Pair of Glasses. It's a classic in AA. And it has everything to do with, it's how I look at things that is going to change those things. The things don't change, but if I can look through a different pair of glasses, if I can look through the eyes of faith, if I can look through the lens of hope, all right, things change. That's the marvelous thing about us human beings. We have this innate ability to project onto the world what's happening inside of us. And that is really at the root of these archetypal images that run through our minds. Johnson continues, as mentioned, the second coming of Christ is available to us as individuals when we are ready, or perhaps even when we choose. This is the Christian way of speaking about enlightenment, heightened consciousness, the experience that relocates your spiritual center of gravity. We are not bound to history. The second coming of Christ is available to us as individuals, and it will wait for us until we are able to remain steady in its presence, which is the point of meditation, to stay with it long enough for it to happen. If I'm gonna give it all of 30 seconds and say, well, God didn't show up. Well, I didn't wait long enough. I have to enter into the silence. I have to enter into the inner world. All right. And then boom, things happen. This intersection of levels happens to people more than we might realize. They don't understand the structure of it, so they just walk off and leave it. But sainthood is more common than we think. Next section, the church and the mass. In the medieval world, there was a proverb that the mass, the communion service, a point in which we shift from time-bound to eternal consciousness, is the interim carrier of Christ. Mass can happen only once, but it can also happen again and again. The church was touching on a non-literal fact and teaching it in the abstruse symbolism of the second coming of Christ. If you have the kind of mind that can think non-literally, there are jewels like this throughout Christianity. The church was also said to be the to be the interim carrier of Christ from his resurrection until his second coming 8 days later. It was said that Christ is like the sun, and the church is like the moon. When the sun is when the sun is farthest from the moon is full. When Christ is farthest from the church is at its greatest power. When the sun and the moon are closest together, the moon has no light at all. As the second coming of Christ approaches, the church will have fulfilled its duty and can disband. There is no church or mass in heaven because there are interim carriers. They are interim carriers of the nature of Christ. Christ is present in heaven, so interim carriers are not needed. Many traditions point that there are two truths, absolute and relative. In Christianity, these are expressed as eternity, which is neither spatial nor temporal, and the church, which is the human dimension. We need both, the church as the interim carrier and the insight into a higher order of things. And I could say the same about AA, that people confuse AA and 12-step fellowships with the end result of the transformation. But it's not, just as the church is not the end result. The church is the intermediate carrier. Our 12-step fellowships are the intermediate carriers of the transformation that you and I need in order to achieve the spiritual transformation that really lies at the heart of recovery. And that doesn't mean we give them up, but it does mean that we put them in the right order. That, one is external and one is internal. And as long as I'm in this world, I'm sticking around. I'm going to meetings, all right? But I'm not worshiping AA, and I'm not worshiping the big book, and I'm not worshiping the church. These are means and the steps. These are means to get me to what? To an awareness of a reality that is within, the great reality that is within. Cultural yearning. As a culture, we hunger for the second coming of Christ. A new kind of consciousness is stirring. People sense this. Some call it the New Age, leaving the age of Pisces, symbolized by two fish, and entering the age of Aquarius, symbolized by the water bearer, a man with a jug on his shoulders, pouring out water. If we take Aquarius back to his Greek roots, we get Ganymede, who was abducted from Earth by Zeus and appointed his cupbearer. He poured the wine at heavenly celebrations. This means more to me than Aquarius. The one who fills the cup with wine is a predecessor of Dionysius and a forerunner of Christ, and is the ruler of the age to come, with similar expectations to the second coming of Christ. Now he's going to break this down, make it a little bit more understandable. He says the hippie movement was a somewhat naive attempt at the second coming, a group of people who wanted something new, the wine of life, exhilaration, motivated by the archetype of the second coming of Christ. The drug culture is another manifestation, although of an exceedingly poor quality, of the demand for the second coming, for the ecstatic experience and the cessation of time and space-bound consciousness. When someone comes to me with a drug problem, I can often touch him by saying, What you're doing is right. Your expectations and demands are valid, but you're doing it in the wrong way. See, what is it we're looking for in the drug, in the food, in the sex? You have to take enough time to ask yourself that question. You know, that's my salvation. That's my God. You know, and what I'm looking for, I'm right to be looking for it, but I'm never going to find it there. You know, so we shouldn't be blamed for our search, but at some point we come to the realization that it isn't out there, it's in here. And this is what the midlife crisis is all about. That one more success isn't going to teach me a damn thing. What's going to teach me a damn thing is to wait long enough to find that peaceful place that does exist inside of each and every one of us, where the great reality resides. Discontent, chaos, and caution to the wind seem to be endemic worldwide. I think it is the stirring of the second coming of Christ, but it needs intelligence behind it. This timeless quality needs time. We're going to blunder for a while before a new consciousness, a new grail castle, a new peak experience will find its solidity. If the second coming is always available, why is the world in such a mess? The best that we are capable of can turn into the worst if we get it on the wrong level. Some of the world's worst messes, like Hitlerism, were fueled and motivated by a sublime archetypal energy. These things can misfire badly. Perhaps they need to misfire until they are mature enough for their sublime aspects to be realized. There is great danger that the archetype of the second coming of Christ, or the once and future king, can erupt in a negative form again. Nazism is an example within living memory. There is nothing that human beings cannot literalize into trouble. Literalism knows no end, and literalism is the death of insight. But that sublime archetypal structure is always available in its true interior way for anyone who chooses to touch it and is capable of touching it. Sometimes the point of contact becomes accessible only in our deepest, darkest moments. Heavy stuff. We're on a spiritual journey. That's what Jung sent Roland on. You need a psychic change. You need a transformation at the deepest level of your mind. You don't need a lobotomy. You need to see things differently. You need to have a different center. You know, the big book says selfishness, self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our troubles. You know, it generates 100 forms of fear. Why? Because I'm not meant to be the center. God is meant to be the center. Whatever faith you may come from, or no faith tradition, it is finding that center outside of self and then rightly relating myself to it or him or her, or however you may define it. That's everything. That's the spiritual awakening. That's the spiritual experience. to be in conscious contact with that reality. This final little subsection is titled Balancing Heaven and Earth, which is exactly what we're talking about. You know, he says, Saint Teresa of Avila was consumed by ecstasy at unpredictable moments. She often found herself caught in a rapture for minutes at a time, sometimes longer. But someone observed that she was never enraptured while she was cooking her breakfast. If she were, she might burn it. Eternity can dovetail into our practical lives. It's possible for us to manage the toast and the rapture. He finishes his last paragraph. He says, we need poets to rescue us from the awful contradictions we get into. Speech is literal and rational and cannot easily contain the depths of the mystery. For that, we need symbols and symbolic language. During Mass, a great symbol of the intersection of time and eternity, we are liberated from space and time. But after Mass, we need to go home and cook our breakfast. We can discover within ourselves the capacity to sustain both the presence of the divine and the holiness of daily life. The two are, in fact, one. Johnson finishes his book with that remark that the inner and the outer can come together. You know, spirituality is not necessarily quitting the day job. Spirituality is not necessarily giving up all my money, all right, and going to become a missionary. Spirituality can get hampered by confusing the levels, by to take, and he has kind of a Catholic aspect on this, but there's really two ways to go. You can in the Catholic tradition, the charge, I'm not saying it's legitimate, but it is the charge, is that Catholics wind up worshiping bread. You know, there's one nice description that I heard of it, that if you go too far in this direction, you wind up worshiping bread, which is not what the intent is. And if you go too far on the Protestant end of things, what do you wind up doing? You wind up worshiping a book. You wind up worshiping the Bible. You commit the sin of literalism, and you get lost in it. And I see this happen in 12-step recovery. It's the same dynamic. The gold that is God, that is too hot to handle, right? Because I won't wait long enough for it to come through to me, all right? It gets projected out onto things that can't carry it, things that will melt or fold or fall under the weight of it. That's what his book's about. That's what projection is all about. And so the solution is not to confuse the levels, not to confuse the levels of the external and the internal, but to balance the two in a circle of wholeness. That's the goal. That's the end result. So I hope you'll buy the book Inner Goal by Johnson. And I hope this little series on projection, I know it was difficult, but I hope you stayed with it, and I hope it was helpful to you in understanding what the spiritual journey is about. So again, thank you for listening. God bless. Keep coming back.